On the afternoon of 25th of September 1900, in the half-furnished ballroom of Rosecliff in Newport, Rhode Island, a silver heiress straightens the pearl buttons of her gloves before she touches the newsprint. Outside, the Atlantic light falls pale over white balustrades. Inside, the only sound is the crisp rustle of paper and silk. A small society notice reports that Mrs. Robert Goelet's large steam yacht Nahma will be laid up for the winter on the Clyde. One line among many, but it describes a familiar ritual. Pleasure withdrawn from view, grandeur sent into seasonal hibernation. She pauses, smoothing the tight kid leather at her wrist, calculating guest lists and itineraries the way her husband calculates freight rates. To the world, she is merely Mrs. Oelrichs or Mrs. Goelet's friend, a gracious hostess whose summers unfold between marble staircases and polished decks. The yachts will sleep in distant shipyards. The women who filled them must remain on display. The prologue ends not with the shimmer of water, but with a quiet thought. Some palaces are easier to mothball than the rolls built to match them. On a cool morning in late September 1900 at Rosecliff on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, workmen's hammers echo faintly under the vast, unfinished ceiling of what will become one of the most photographed ballrooms in America. The heiress whose Comstock-load fortune paid for this French-style palace, Teresa Fair Oelrichs, daughter of Nevada silver baron James Graham Fair, walks the length of the space in white kid gloves, testing the scale of a room designed for waltzes and ocean-facing windows. Her footsteps make no sound on the temporary planking. Through tall windows, September sunlight catches the marble balustrades outside, turning them the color of old ivory. A letter from her architect Stanford White, dated earlier that summer, confirms the house is nearly ready for entertaining on a grand scale. Estate accounts preserved in the Newport Preservation Society archives show costs approaching $2.5 million. The price of turning mining wealth into social legitimacy, of converting silver extracted from Nevada mountainsides into carved French limestone facing the Atlantic. Her husband, Hermann Oelrichs, American agent for the Norddeutscher Lloyd steamship line, manages transatlantic routes and passenger manifests. She manages invitations, menus, seating plans, and the delicate choreography of who stands where when the music begins. In a contemporary society column clipped and preserved in family papers, she is described as strongly addicted to society as a business. The phrase appears casual, almost affectionate, but it captures something essential. This is work, not leisure. Her white gloves, adjusted and readjusted as she walks from window to window, are as much tools of that business as ledgers and telegraph cables. She smooths the kid leather at her wrists, feeling the slight resistance of the pearl buttons. Outside, gardeners are planting the formal beds that will frame the terrace. Inside, plasterers are finishing the garlands and rosettes that will hang above dancers' heads. The ballroom is 60 feet long. She knows this because she has paced it, mentally arranging where the orchestra will sit, where supper will be laid, how many couples can waltz without crowding. Her mother-in-law, the formidable Mrs. Charles May Oelrichs, has already remarked in correspondence that Newport expects nothing less than perfection from a woman whose fortune could have built a dozen such houses. The unstated message is clear. Money alone is not enough. Grace, timing, and flawless execution matter more. Through another window, the Atlantic stretches gray-blue under September clouds. Somewhere on that water, or laid up in some distant shipyard, are the yachts that will return next summer. Nahma, Alva, Atalanta, and dozens more, each one a floating extension of the marble palaces lining this shore. She will stand at railings and on terraces, performing introductions and orchestrating the seamless flow of guests between decks and drawing rooms. The work is invisible when done well. That, she has learned, is the point. Stanford White's office has sent sketches of the completed interiors. White and gold, mirrors and chandeliers, a ceiling painted to suggest an Italian sky. It will be, the architect promises, a perfect stage. What he does not say, because it does not need saying, is that she will be performing on it for the rest of her life. While steamship lines move migrants and goods across the ocean, Their heiress hostesses learned to move people across ballrooms and decks with equal precision. Each introduction timed, each seating arrangement calculated, each smile deployed at exactly the right moment to smooth over a potential social misstep or business tension. By the summer of 1892, Marble House was complete, $11 million worth of carved stone and gilding rising above the Newport cliffs, described by the Preservation Society in later guidebooks as a summer cottage that transformed the town into a global symbol of wealth and architectural ambition. The phrase summer cottage becomes a kind of Newport joke, a way of acknowledging the absurdity of calling a mansion designed to rival European palaces a casual, seasonal retreat. Alva Vanderbilt, the woman who commissioned it, understands the power of such ironies. She has spent years studying how to wield architecture as a weapon in social warfare. A few years earlier, after William K. Vanderbilt inherited $65 million in 1885, Alva had ordered a steam yacht of her own. Alva, 285 feet long, built at the Harlan and Hollingsworth shipyard in Wilmington, Delaware, and hailed in contemporary maritime publications as the largest private yacht in the world, longer even than Mrs. Astor's Norma Hull. Newspaper illustrations from the yacht's launch show a vessel that combined the elegance of a sailing ship with the power of modern steam engines, twin masts, a single black funnel, and enough staterooms to accommodate a small diplomatic mission. Estate historian J.W. Buell notes in his study of Gilded Age leisure that Alva spent the next decade cruising as far as Egypt aboard this yacht, treating the Mediterranean as casually as others might treat a carriage ride to Central Park. Census records and family biographies place her daughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt, within this world of mirrored salons and polished brass railings, a girl whose future title would be negotiated as strategically as her father's shipping and railroad assets, whose childhood unfolded between the marble palace on land and the floating palace at sea. The yacht's interiors, documented in contemporary descriptions and later maritime histories, featured carved mahogany paneling, velvet upholstery in deep reds and golds, and a main saloon that could seat 20 for dinner without crowding. On deck, awnings provided shade for afternoon tea. Below, engine rooms employed a crew whose names rarely appeared in any social columns, but whose labor made every smooth crossing possible. The contrast between visible luxury and invisible labor was absolute. Guests arriving at the gangway saw only polished brass and fresh paint. They did not see the coal bunkers, the crew quarters, the machinery that turned leisure into a kind of perpetual motion. On 25 July 1892, the first Alva met her end in fog off Cape Cod, struck by a freighter in the early morning hours. Later divers would find her as a ghost of iron and timber on the seabed, her elegant interiors scattered across the ocean floor. Contemporary newspaper accounts emphasized the dramatic rescue of passengers and crew, the heroism of the freighter's captain who came about in heavy seas to search for survivors. What the papers did not dwell on was the quiet fact that the yacht, for all its grandeur, had been as vulnerable as any other vessel, that money could not buy immunity from weather, navigation errors, or the simple physics of collision. For Alva, the loss was an inconvenience. She would commission another yacht, and another, each one more impressive than the last. For her daughter Consuelo, then barely 15, it was an early lesson that even the grandest platforms for display could vanish overnight, that the marble palace remained while the floating palace became wreckage, and that permanence and performance were not the same thing. In later years, when asked about her childhood, Consuelo would remember the yacht with a mixture of nostalgia and something harder to name, the knowledge that every elegant afternoon at sea had been, in some sense, borrowed time. The marble palace, at least, could not sink. It could only be inherited, maintained, and eventually transformed into a museum where future generations would walk through rooms that once held balls for 400 guests, trying to imagine the sound of silk rustling over marble floors, the clink of champagne glasses, the careful orchestration of an evening designed to demonstrate that American money had finally learned European grace. The next yacht and the next generation would be expected to shine even more brightly than the last. because in this world, standing still meant falling behind. On a hazy day in the summer of 1885, the steam yacht Atalanta, 228 feet long, cuts through the water off New York Harbor, its profile captured in engravings that will later be preserved in maritime museums and private collections. A long white hull, thin black funnel, flags snapping in the wind, the whole vessel presenting an image of controlled power and effortless elegance. The yacht belongs to railroad magnate Jay Gould, one of the archetypal robber barons of the era, a man whose name appears in financial newspapers alongside words like speculation, manipulation, and consolidation, but who understood that social legitimacy required more than market dominance. Society pages in the New York Times and Harper's Weekly note that Atalanta appears at Cowes during the English yachting season and at other European ports, a visible declaration that American money can now travel with European style, that the gap between old wealth and new is closing with every transatlantic crossing. The yacht's presence in European waters is not simply leisure. It is diplomacy conducted on a floating platform, a way of announcing arrival without needing to rent someone else's palace or depend on hotel accommodations. Inside, contemporary descriptions preserved in maritime histories reveal interiors designed to impress without overwhelming. Carpets from Persia in deep blues and crimsons, polished brass fixtures that caught lamplight in the evening, a main saloon where dinner could be served for 12 beneath a ceiling, painted to suggest classical ruins and Italian skies. The dining table was bolted to the deck but covered with Irish linen. The chairs were upholstered in leather that could withstand salt air and still look elegant when diplomats or minor European royalty came aboard for luncheon. For Gould's daughters and their peers, women whose names appeared in social columns as Miss Ain or the Mrs. Gould, crossing the Atlantic on such vessels meant learning to move gracefully as the deck shifted beneath them, to pour tea from a silver service without spilling despite the roll of the sea, to greet dignitaries at railings instead of drawing-room doors. Letters home from these voyages, preserved in family archives, describe the curious sensation of maintaining perfect posture while the horizon tilted, of practicing piano in a saloon where the instrument was bolted to the floor and the music stand required constant adjustment. One such letter, written by a young woman aboard a similar yacht in 1887 and later donated to a historical society, notes, "Mother insists I practice my curtsy. Even at sea, though the deck makes it rather absurd, I have learned to time my descent with the waves, down as the bow rises, up as it settles. She says a lady must be graceful in any circumstance." The dry humor barely conceals the relentless training, the understanding that every moment, even in the middle of the Atlantic, was an opportunity to perfect the performance that would be required in European drawing rooms and Newport ballrooms. The crew's perspective, when it surfaces at all in logbooks and employment records, reveals a different reality. The Atalanta required a staff of 35 to operate and maintain, from engineers and stokers in the engine room to stewards who served meals and valets who pressed evening clothes. Their quarters, located in the forward sections of the vessel, were functional and cramped, narrow bunks, shared washing facilities, and a galley where meals were prepared under conditions that bore no resemblance to the elegance visible above deck. The engineering logs note coal consumption, engine temperatures, and routine maintenance. The social columns note only arrivals and departures, as if the yacht moved by magic rather than labor. Maritime historians emphasize how quickly such yachts became platforms for social networking that transcended national boundaries. An American heiress who could conduct herself flawlessly on a rolling deck, who could converse in French with a visiting count while the yacht steamed toward Monte Carlo, who could orchestrate a shipboard dinner that impressed even the most critical European guests. Such a woman had acquired skills that would serve her whether she remained in America or married into a foreign aristocracy. Here, mobility itself becomes a form of privilege. Yachts as salons in motion, carrying heiresses between Newport Cowes and continental winter resorts, each voyage a classroom where the curriculum was grace under pressure, and the final examination was marriage. The Atalanta's later history traces the strange afterlife of Gilded Age yachts. Sold to the Venezuelan government in 1896, she became the gunboat restaurador, serving under different flags and in different conflicts, far from the elegant waters where she had once carried railroad heirs and their daughters. But in 1885, steaming through New York Harbor with flags flying, she represented something else, the idea that the same skills that steadied a teacup on a rolling deck would later steady a smile in a negotiation for a title, that learning to maintain composure at sea was simply practice for maintaining composure in every other arena where women's performance was scrutinized and judged. By May 1898, trunks were stacked in the entrance hall of a Fifth Avenue townhouse, their leather surfaces marked with hotel labels from previous seasons. Claridge's in London, the Hôtel de Paris in Monte Carlo, the Grand Hôtel des Bains in Venice. 19th century travel guides and contemporary household manuals list as many as 10 steamer trunks, a dozen hat boxes, and multiple dress cases for a single heiress heading to Newport or Europe for the summer season, a logistical undertaking that requires detailed packing lists, careful tissue paper wrapping, and the coordination of maids whose sole responsibility is ensuring that evening gowns arrive uncrushed and morning dresses properly pressed. In one of Alva Vanderbilt's circles, packing lists survive in household papers archived at historical societies. Evening gowns in silk taffeta and velvet, visiting dresses in linen and lightweight wool, parasols with carved ivory handles, fans painted by European artists, and always multiple pairs of gloves, suede for daytime calls, white kid for dinner, long opera gloves that reached past the elbow for formal evenings on deck. Each pair represented a specific social occasion, a particular moment in the day's carefully choreographed performance. To appear with the wrong gloves was to announce either ignorance or rebellion, and neither was acceptable. Letters between society hostesses, preserved in family correspondence collections, comment dryly on the absurd quantity of trunks needed for even a few weeks abroad, yet the complaints carry an undertone of pride. The ability to travel with such an entourage was itself a mark of status. These letters trace a map of movement that defined the lives of wealthy American women. New York to Newport by private railroad car in early June, then on to Cowes for the regatta season in August, perhaps Cannes or Nice for autumn, occasionally the Italian lakes, often by private yacht or in first-class accommodations aboard transatlantic steamers where the wealthiest passengers occupied entire suites and brought their own servants. A particularly detailed letter from 1895, written by a woman traveling with her daughter to London for the season, describes the orchestration required. We sailed Tuesday on the Teutonic. First-class forward cabins already reserved. Margaret's trunks number 8, plus hat boxes. Her maid assures me nothing can be left behind. The white gloves alone fill one case. I sometimes think we're not traveling, but rather relocating an entire wardrobe across an ocean, bringing New York to London wholesale. The tone is exasperated, but also matter-of-fact. This was simply how things were done among families whose fortunes made such movements routine. The physical act of packing carried its own rituals. Contemporary household guides published in ladies' magazines described the proper folding of delicate fabrics, the use of tissue paper between layers, the strategic placement of heavier items at the bottom of trunks to prevent crushing. Shoes were stuffed with paper to maintain their shape. Hats were secured in specially designed boxes. Jewelry traveled in smaller cases that remained with the lady or her personal maid at all times. Nothing was left to chance because arrival at the other end required immediate perfection. There would be no time to recover from travel, no period of adjustment before social duties resumed. For the young women at the center of this machinery, daughters being transported from one social arena to another, the trunks became both a symbol and reality of their lives. Portable, adaptable, always ready to be repacked for the next destination. Before a young woman ever chose a husband, someone else had already chosen her seasons, her ports, her wardrobe, the very rhythm of her years. Letters written home from finishing schools reveal an awareness of this predetermined geography. Mother writes that, We will summer in Newport as usual. Then perhaps Scotland in September if the Astors' invitation comes through. One girl notes in 1896, I am learning to think of home as whichever trunk is currently unpacked. The gloves, carefully wrapped and counted, were perhaps the most essential items in any trunk. They wore out quickly. Kid leather stained, seams split, pearl buttons came loose, and replacements had to be ordered from specific glovers in London or Paris, whose work met exacting standards. Account books show regular expenses for gloves: $6 for day gloves, $8 for evening, $12 for opera length. Over a season, a single young woman might go through 24 pairs. They were consumable markers of gentility, renewed constantly, never allowed to look worn or shabby. Contemporary fashion illustrations in Harper's Bazaar and Godey's Ladies' Book show the gloves being worn at all hours, extending up the arm for formal occasions, stopping at the wrist for afternoon calls, sometimes removed for dinner but immediately replaced afterward. Etiquette manuals specified when gloves must be worn and when they might be removed, creating an elaborate code where the covered hand signified formality and social distance, while the bare hand suggested intimacy or impropriety. A young woman pulling on gloves before leaving her cabin to walk the deck of a yacht was not simply dressing. She was armoring herself for social observation, ensuring that every detail of her appearance communicated the right messages about breeding, propriety, and marriageability. Every carefully folded glove in those trunks was a promise to appear perfectly composed, no matter where the tide carried her. Whether walking onto a yacht deck in Newport, descending a staircase at Cowes, or entering a London drawing room where her performance would be evaluated by women who had been judging such performances for generations. The trunks would be unpacked and repacked dozens of times, but the gloves remained constant, white, spotless, always ready to cover whatever doubts or desires might lie beneath. In the 1890s, institutions like Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, and various European academies provided what contemporaries call a finishing to the education of wealthy girls. French, music, literature, and the deportment expected of future hostesses and chatelaines. Their alumni lists and prospectuses emphasize poise, good breeding, and correct social intercourse, phrases that sound vague but refer to very specific skills: how to enter a room, how to modulate conversation across different levels of society, how to signal interest or dismissal with the slightest gesture. These schools understand that their students are not being prepared for intellectual work, but for social work, and the curriculum reflects that reality. Contemporary photographs of Miss Porters show young women in high-necked shirtwaists and long skirts, their hair arranged with careful simplicity, standing in neat rows outside brick buildings that suggest both privilege and discipline. The school's location in a small Connecticut town, far from the distractions of New York or Newport, was deliberate. These years were meant to be a kind of chrysalis, a protected space where rough edges could be polished away and proper habits instilled before the young women emerged into the scrutiny of ballrooms and drawing rooms. Daily schedules preserved in school archives reveal a routine that combined academic subjects with intensive social training. French lessons began at 9, taught by native speakers who corrected pronunciation with exacting precision. Music practice, piano, voice, sometimes harp, occupied the late morning, with instructors who emphasized not virtuosity but the kind of competent, pleasing performance expected at evening gatherings. Afternoons included literature, art history, and what school catalogs delicately termed deportment and grace, which meant practicing how to sit, stand, walk, curtsy, and conduct a conversation while maintaining perfect posture and an expression of serene interest. A letter written home by a student in 1893, preserved in a family archive, captures the exhausting precision of this training. We spend an hour each day simply practicing how to walk, chin level, shoulders back, books balanced on our heads to ensure we do not slouch. Madame Renard says we must learn to move as if we are floating, as if our bodies weigh nothing. Yesterday, I failed to maintain proper posture and had to repeat the exercise for an additional 30 minutes. My back aches constantly, but Madame says this is the price of elegance. For a Vanderbilt or Goelet daughter, such lessons did not end at the school gate. On board ship, captain's logs and press reports of yacht cruises mention carefully staged luncheons and teas with diplomats, naval officers, and European aristocrats invited aboard. The same straight back demanded in the school dining room was now required on a swaying deck. The same skill in conversation was tested across languages and titles, with mistakes potentially more costly than a poor grade. Learning to maintain composure while the floor moved beneath you was literal training for a life where instability would be constant, but could never be acknowledged. Contemporary. Etiquette manuals published for elite audiences provide detailed instructions for shipboard behavior: when to appear on deck, how to greet fellow passengers, the proper costume for different hours of the day, the protocol for dining with the captain or receiving guests at port. These manuals emphasize that a yacht is not simply a mode of transportation, but a stage, and that every moment aboard is an opportunity for observation and judgment. A young woman who stumbled on deck, who appeared with windblown hair, who failed to maintain gracious conversation despite seasickness, revealed a lack of proper training that could affect her family's social standing and her own marital prospects. The curriculum also included less visible skills: how to manage servants discreetly, how to plan menus that impressed without appearing ostentatious, how to navigate hierarchies of precedence in seating arrangements and introductions. These were essentially managerial competencies disguised as social graces, and they were taught with the same attention to detail as the more obviously performative aspects of deportment. Letters between school administrators and parents reveal an understanding that the goal was not simply to create ornamental young women, but to prepare them for what one headmistress termed the practical responsibilities of maintaining a prominent household. One such letter, dated 1891 and found in Miss Porter's school archives, responds to a mother's concern that her daughter was spending too much time on academic subjects and not enough on social preparation. I assure you that Miss Almy's education is perfectly balanced for her future position. While she excels at languages and literature, she also demonstrates increasing mastery of those social arts, which will serve her far more in drawing rooms than any amount of Latin ever could. Yesterday, she orchestrated tea for 20 guests, managing conversation and service with exactly the grace you hope to see. Education, in this context, was not about the development of individual intellectual capacity, but about the perfection of a role, the transformation of a girl into a specific kind of woman who could serve as the human interface between fortunes and the wider world. The straight back, the modulated voice, the ability to pour tea or play piano or converse in French were not skills for personal enrichment, but tools for maintaining family alliances and social position. What appeared as refinement was actually intensive professional training for a career that could never be acknowledged as such. By the time these young women returned home from school, their bodies and voices had been reshaped by years of practice. They moved differently, spoke differently, even held their heads at different angles than when they had arrived. Their handwriting practice in the schoolroom, endless repetitions of perfect copperplate script, would become the fluent notes that sustained alliances from Newport to Nice. They had been taught essentially to make the performance invisible, to embody grace so completely that it appeared natural rather than constructed. That this required the suppression of other potential selves was not discussed. The point was not to develop what a girl might want to be, but to perfect what she was expected to become. In 1894, as Consuelo Vanderbilt nears 18, her mother, Alva, intensified a private curriculum designed to prepare her daughter not for American society, but for European aristocracy. The training goes beyond what any finishing school could provide. This is a specialized education in the protocols and expectations of British nobility, a crash course in becoming a duchess. French governesses arrived to polish Consuelo's already fluent French into something that can hold its own in Parisian salons. Music masters push her piano technique from competent to accomplished. Most significantly, Alva herself supervises strict schedules of posture and presentation, drilling her daughter in the particular style of dignity required in English country houses where American money might be welcome, but American manners would be scrutinized. In her later memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, published decades after her marriage ended, Consuelo recalls her mother's relentless focus on duty and the social ambitions that underpinned it, describing herself as a sacrifice to strategy rather than romance. The book is careful, measured, written with the perspective of someone who has had years to consider the architecture of her own life, but certain passages reveal the emotional weight of those final months before marriage, the sense of being shaped like clay, molded into a specific form regardless of whether that form felt natural or comfortable. Newspaper coverage of her eventual marriage to Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, in November 1895, emphasizes the size of her dowry. Contemporary accounts put it at $2.5 million plus an annual income, the price for restoring Blenheim Palace's crumbling roofs and settling its debts, and the grandeur of the ceremony at St. Thomas's Church in New York. Society columns call it the wedding of the century, dedicating full pages to descriptions of her gown, the floral arrangements, the guest list that read like a directory of industrial America. What these accounts do not mention, because such things were not discussed in public, was that the bride had begged not to go through with it, that her mother had locked her in her room until she agreed to comply. Consuelo later wrote, "To be punished for the guilt of others is essentially unfair." A brief but telling comment on the emotional burden of a union, arranged to repair a ducal estate with American money. The line appears almost casually in her memoir, tucked between descriptions of Blenheim's grandeur and the routines of English country house life, but it carries the weight of someone who has spent years considering whether her suffering served any larger purpose or simply fed her mother's ambition. The training she received in those final months before the wedding was both practical and psychological. She learned the complicated hierarchies of British peerage, who took precedence over whom, which titles outranked others, how to address everyone from earls to viscounts to younger sons of marquesses. She learned which topics were acceptable in English drawing rooms and which marked one as American and gauche. She learned that English country houses were cold, that fires were lit only in rooms currently occupied, that one dressed for dinner even when dining alone with family. She learned that American exuberance was considered vulgar, that restraint and understatement were the highest forms of elegance in a society that had been practicing such restraint for centuries. Letters she wrote to friends in the months before her marriage, preserved in various archives, show a young woman trying to reconcile herself to duty. "Mother says I will have everything: title, position, a palace, security for our family's place in society. When she lists these things, they sound like enough, but at night when I'm alone, they feel like a trade of one prison for another, marble for duty, Newport for Blenheim. At least in America, I know the rules." The tone is not melodramatic but resigned, the voice of someone who has already understood that protest is useless. The wedding photographs show her in a dress designed to suggest both American wealth and appropriate European dignity, white satin and lace, a train that required multiple attendants to manage, a veil that covered her face until the vows were spoken. Her expression, visible in the few moments when the veil was lifted, appears composed but remote, the face of someone performing a role perfectly, while maintaining a careful distance from the performance itself. Contemporary observers remarked on her beauty and grace. No one mentioned that perfection often requires the suppression of everything that does not serve it. Her training was successful by every external measure. Title gained, Blenheim's roof repaired, her mother's ambition satisfied, the newspapers declaring a triumph of American wealth and English tradition. In The Glitter and the Gold, she describes resuming life at Blenheim after an early illness. "When I recovered, we returned to Blenheim and to the routine of house parties, and I to the duties of a châtelaine." The word duties does heavy work in that sentence, encompassing everything from overseeing servants to entertaining guests to producing heirs. She learned those duties the way she had learned everything else, through observation, practice, and the suppression of preferences that did not align with requirements. Years later, after the marriage produced 2 sons and then slowly dissolved into separate lives and eventual annulment, Consuelo would reflect that the training itself had been a kind of erasure, not violent or dramatic, but thorough. She had learned to speak, move, and think like a duchess, which meant unlearning how to speak, move, and think like herself. On deck and in the drawing room alike, she had learned how to keep her gloves spotless while her heart was anything but, how to present a surface so polished that no one could see what lay beneath it, how to make performance indistinguishable from identity until the two became the same thing. The tragedy, if it could be called that, was not the marriage itself, but the years of preparation that made it possible, the careful construction of a woman who could fulfill a role even when that role required the abandonment of every other possibility. Her mother had succeeded brilliantly in creating a duchess. What had been lost in that creation was a question that Consuelo would spend the rest of her life trying to answer, long after the gloves had been put away and the performance was no longer required. By the mid-1890s, records from institutions like the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia and the New York Yacht Club's headquarters on West 44th Street show the extent of organized elite yachting. Tenders, club steamers, and private vessels serving members whose names read like a directory of Gilded Age wealth: Vanderbilt, Morgan, Gould, Astor, Belmont. Club minutes preserved in archives detail the careful orchestration of regattas, cruises, and social gatherings that mixed leisure with business, where deals might be discussed over cigars on deck and alliances cemented during shipboard dinners that appeared casual but followed careful protocols of precedence and position. In club promotional literature and member handbooks, the yachts are described in technical terms: tonnage, speed, range, engine specifications. Yet their real purpose is social, to transport small groups of families and guests between secluded islands, resort towns, and European ports where the American wealthy could mingle with their European counterparts on what felt like neutral territory. Passenger lists and guest books show how heiresses circulate through these spaces, sometimes noted only as Miss or the Misses, yet expected to remember every name, title, crest, and family connection, to navigate complicated social networks where a forgotten detail could cause offense. The Jekyll Island Club, founded in 1886, offers a particularly clear example of how these institutions functioned. Contemporary accounts describe it as the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world, a private island where members' combined wealth was estimated at 1/6 of the world's capital. Access required not merely money, but the right connections, the right family background, the right demonstration of belonging to a very specific social stratum. The club maintained its own fleet of steamers to transport members from Brunswick, Georgia to the island, ensuring that the journey itself reinforced exclusivity. You could not simply arrive. You had to be brought. Letters between club members reveal the social mechanics. Invitations extended months in advance, coordinated arrivals to ensure compatible groups, carefully planned activities that mixed outdoor recreation with formal dinners and evening entertainment. Women's roles in this machinery were essential but largely invisible in official records. While men discussed railroad mergers and banking ventures, women managed the social logistics that made such discussions possible, arranging introductions, orchestrating seating, diffusing tensions, creating an atmosphere where business could be conducted without the awkwardness of appearing too explicitly commercial. A journal entry from 1897, written by a woman spending several weeks at Jekyll Island, captures the dual nature of these gatherings. The days follow a pleasant routine: mornings spent in reading or walking the beach, afternoons in casual conversation, evenings in dinner and cards. Yet beneath the leisure runs a current of evaluation: who speaks to whom, who sits beside whom at dinner, which families are growing closer and which are more distant. These are the real activities, far more important than the stated program of sailing and hunting. Similar patterns appear in records from the New York Yacht Club, though there the focus is more explicitly on the vessels themselves. Founded in 1844, by the 1890s the club maintained detailed registries of members' yachts: name, tonnage, builder, engine type, previous owners. These registries read like genealogies of maritime privilege, showing how yachts passed between families, sometimes through sale, but often through complex transactions that mixed finance with alliance. A yacht might be sold to a future son-in-law at a price that reflected not market value but strategic relationship building. Club regattas served similar dual purposes, ostensibly sporting competitions but actually elaborate social choreographies where the right people could be brought together under circumstances that appeared casual while being carefully managed. Photographs from Cow's Week in the 1890s show decks crowded with men in blazers and women in elaborate yachting costumes, striped jackets, sailor hats, long skirts that somehow managed to suggest nautical themes while maintaining complete propriety. The women in these photographs are smiling, apparently relaxed, but letters and diaries reveal the exhausting performance required, maintaining perfect grooming in salt air and wind, conducting gracious conversation while managing seasickness, appearing effortlessly elegant while navigating narrow decks in restrictive clothing. The infrastructure of this leisure, coal bunkers, engine rooms, maintenance crews, shore facilities, remains largely invisible in both contemporary accounts and historical records. Club logbooks note coal deliveries and repair schedules, but rarely mention the names of workers who kept the machinery running. Society columns describe arrivals and departures, but never explain the logistics that made such movements possible. An elegant photograph of a yacht at anchor off Newport or Cowes conceals an army of unseen workers. Not just the crew aboard the vessel, but also the shore staff, the coal suppliers, the sailmakers, the provisioners, the hotel workers who accommodated guests before and after voyages. For the heiresses who circulated through this world, the invisibility of labor was part of the education, learning not to see the machinery that enabled their lives, training themselves to focus only on the polished surface while ignoring everything that lay beneath. This selective vision was essential to maintaining the fiction that their lives were naturally elegant rather than constructed through enormous expenditures of money and effort. To acknowledge the work required would be to admit that elegance was performed rather than inherent, and such acknowledgement would undermine the entire social system. Maritime historians who study this era emphasize how the clubs created a parallel geography, a network of privileged spaces that existed alongside but separate from the commercial world. Members could travel from Jekyll Island to Newport to Cowes to the Mediterranean and never leave what was essentially an extended private club, never interact with anyone outside their social stratum except through the formal hierarchies of employer and employee. The yachts were not merely transportation but also portable territories, carrying their owners' privileges with them wherever they went. Yet even this carefully constructed world showed cracks. Insurance records from the period reveal the constant threat of shipwreck, mechanical failure, and financial reversal. Yachts were expensive to maintain and vulnerable to both nature and changing economic conditions. Some club members found themselves overextended, forced to sell their vessels or quietly resign memberships. Others saw their fortunes decline gradually, maintaining appearances while cutting costs in ways only those watching closely would notice. Each glamorous photograph of a yacht at anchor concealed an army of unseen workers below the waterline and below stairs, and also concealed precarious financial calculations that made the entire enterprise possible. On an August evening around 1900, as a yacht lies at anchor off Cowes during regatta week, manners manuals and hostess handbooks lay out expected conduct with the precision of legal documents. Gloves on for arrival on deck, removed discreetly at the beginning of dinner, returned immediately upon conclusion for evening promenade. Surviving etiquette books from the period, preserved in historical societies and private libraries, devote entire sections to the carriage of the hands, the correct removal of gloves, and the importance of never leaving bare fingers visible in formal social settings unless explicitly appropriate. One such manual, published in 1897 entitled simply The Correct Thing for Women, specifies gloves must be worn at all outdoor gatherings, including those on yacht decks and terraces. They may be removed for dinner service, but should be drawn on again before rising from the table. A lady's hands, unless engaged in dining or private correspondence, should always be gloved in company. The removal of gloves signals intimacy and should not be undertaken lightly. The language is authoritative, allowing no room for interpretation or personal preference. For an heiress moving through this world, these rituals become a language more nuanced than speech. A glove removed signals intimacy or informality. A glove kept on creates a polite barrier, establishing social distance even in close physical proximity. In letters between friends, preserved in various family papers, comments about another woman's gloves function as shorthand for judging her understanding of the entire social code. She appeared at the garden party with day gloves rather than afternoon gloves, one woman wrote to another in 1895, which tells you everything about her preparation or lack thereof. The gloves themselves were carefully chosen objects, each pair representing a significant expense and selected for specific occasions. Kid leather for general day wear, soft and supple enough to allow hand movement while maintaining a smooth appearance. Suede for informal morning calls, slightly more casual but still demonstrating proper attention. White kid for formal evening events, often with pearl buttons or delicate embroidery. Opera-length gloves reaching past the elbow for balls and theatrical performances, creating a continuous line from sleeve to fingertip that suggested both elegance and inapproachability. Contemporary fashion magazines like Harper's Bazaar and The Delineator published detailed illustrations showing exactly how gloves should be worn, removed, and carried. The process of removing evening gloves was itself choreographed. Begin at the wrist, roll the leather down the arm, fold the gloves once they are removed and then carry them with the folded edge outward. To simply pull off gloves was considered unforgivably crude, a violation that marked someone as hopelessly ignorant of proper form. Young women practiced these movements until they became automatic, until the small rituals of glove wearing required no conscious thought. Account books from wealthy households show the expense of maintaining proper gloves. Bills from glovers in London, Paris, and New York often listing 2 or 3 dozen pairs purchased in a single season. Kid leather stained easily. Wine, food, even perspiration could leave marks, and gloves were rarely cleaned, instead being discarded after a few wearings and replaced. The economics of such consumption were rarely discussed, but they reinforced social hierarchies. Only those with sufficient wealth could maintain the constant renewal of spotless gloves required by etiquette. The physical sensation of wearing gloves for hours at a time rarely appears in contemporary accounts, perhaps because acknowledging discomfort would be admitting weakness. Yet occasional diary entries hint at the reality. Hands that grew warm and damp inside kid leather, fingers that were cramped from holding the prescribed graceful position, skin that developed rashes from dye or from the relentless enclosure. One diary entry from 1898, written late at night after a long evening event, notes, "Finally removed my gloves at 11. My hands felt as though they were emerging from bandages. Strange how something meant to make us elegant can feel so much like constraint." On shipboard, the requirements intensified because salt air and wind could damage gloves more quickly than indoor environments. Women traveling by yacht often packed multiple pairs for each day. A fresh pair for afternoon appearance on deck, another for evening, replacements in case of damage. This meant coordination with ladies' maids responsible for keeping gloves clean, organized, and ready. The logistics of glove management alone could occupy significant time and attention, though such details rarely surfaced in social correspondence that maintained the fiction of effortless elegance. The language of gloves extended beyond their presence or absence to include how they were worn. Gloves buttoned only halfway signaled casual afternoon gathering. Fully buttoned gloves indicated formal occasion. Gloves carried rather than worn suggested one had just arrived or was about to depart, a transitional state. Contemporary illustrations in etiquette guides show these variations with the precision of technical diagrams, emphasizing that every detail communicated meaning to those trained to read the code. Perhaps most significantly, gloves created a physical barrier between the wearer and the world, a thin layer of kid leather that meant no direct contact with anything or anyone outside formal dinner settings. Handshakes, when they occurred, happened through gloves. Touching railings, doorknobs, or garden flowers meant touching them through fabric. Even the simple act of receiving a calling card involved the gloved fingers. This constant mediation reinforced the idea that upper-class women existed at a remove from ordinary physical reality, that their bodies required protection and buffering from direct engagement with the material world. Letters between mothers and daughters often included reminders about gloves, treating them as both practical items and moral symbols. Remember your gloves meant not just the physical objects, but the entire code of behavior they represented, the constant attention to propriety, the awareness of being observed, the understanding that every detail mattered. A forgotten glove was not merely an oversight, but a failure of the discipline that maintained social position. As fashions changed in the early 20th century, as society became somewhat less rigid about some protocols, gloves remained among the last bastions of formal etiquette. Even when other rules relaxed, the expectation that proper women wore proper gloves at proper occasions persisted. The gloves became, in effect, the visible symbol of an entire system of constraint and performance, small enough to seem trivial, significant enough to carry enormous weight. Later, when fortunes fell and yachts were sold, when the grand houses were closed or converted to other uses, gloves would be among the few items light enough to carry into a different life. They could be folded into a small case, transported easily, pulled out when needed, as proof of having once belonged to that vanished world. In archives and museums today, such gloves survive, anonymous, delicate, still carrying the shape of hands that last wore them more than a century ago. Here, even the smallest gesture is freighted with meaning. A tug at the wrist becomes a way of negotiating space within invisible rules that shaped entire lives. On a summer night in August 1902, when Rosecliff was newly completed and already establishing itself as one of Newport's most ambitious architectural statements, contemporary accounts describe balls where hundreds of guests pass under its plaster garlands modeled after Versailles, and out onto terraces overlooking the Atlantic. The scene, documented in society columns and later by architectural historians, represents the culmination of years of planning, a palace designed specifically for entertaining, every room calibrated for maximum social effect, the entire structure functioning as a stage for Theresa Fair Oelrichs to demonstrate her mastery of the machinery of high society. Tessie's guest lists, preserved in family papers now held by historical societies and recounted by later biographers, place railroad magnates beside diplomats, steamship executives beside foreign visitors, creating carefully balanced gatherings where business interests and social alliances could intersect under the guise of leisure. Her husband Herman's position as American agent for the Norddeutscher Lloyd steamship line gives her an edge in organizing this particular form of diplomacy. She can offer European guests introductions to American capital, American hosts access to European connections, all conducted with apparent effortlessness in a ballroom whose construction costs alone could have funded a small city. A niece later recalled that Tessie treated society as a business, a phrase that captures how she approached entertaining, not as pleasure, but as work requiring constant attention, strategic thinking, and ruthless execution. Letters between Tessie and her sister Virginia show this mindset clearly. Detailed lists of who must be invited and who strategically excluded. Calculations of which families are rising and which declining. Notes on recent social missteps by others that could be exploited or must be avoided. The correspondence reveals a mind that viewed every interaction as a transaction, every seating arrangement as a statement, every detail of service and decoration as an opportunity to advance or defend social position. The logistics of hosting at this scale required staff coordination that went far beyond simple household management. Contemporary household manuals and estate records show the infrastructure: kitchens, wine cellars, silver vaults, linen rooms, servant hierarchies that placed everyone from the butler down to the lowest kitchen maid in precise ranking. For a ball hosting 300 or 400 guests, preparation began days in advance. Flowers ordered from New York and delivered by special train. Musicians engaged from Boston. chefs brought in to supplement the household staff, local workers hired to manage carriages and assist with service. Tessie moved through this machinery with the precision of a conductor, her white evening gloves as much a tool of management as any ledger or schedule. Contemporary photographs show her in formal evening dress, posture erect, expression composed, the image of a gracious hostess. What the photographs do not show is the hours of planning each event required, the calculations she performed constantly about who needed to be flattered or strategically ignored, the exhausting performance of making difficult coordination appear effortless. Herman's work with Norddeutscher Lloyd meant regular travel between New York and European ports, connections that allowed Tessie to extend invitations to visiting aristocrats and diplomats who might otherwise have had no reason to come to Newport. Society columns note the presence of German officials, British naval officers, French businessmen at Rosecliff entertainments, their attendance lending international prestige to gatherings that might otherwise have been merely American displays of wealth. The yacht connections, Norddeutscher Lloyd operated some of the fastest transatlantic liners, meant that European guests arrived on vessels Herman's company managed, creating a seamless pipeline from European ports to Newport terraces. But the work also extracted a price that rarely appears in contemporary accounts. Letters between Tessie and her sister hint at exhaustion, complaints about endless obligations, occasional sharp comments about the relentlessness of maintaining position. "I am tired beyond description," she writes after one particularly elaborate season, "and yet already planning next year's calendar. To stop would be to slide backward, and I cannot allow that." The tone suggests someone who has come to see herself as essential machinery in a system that cannot be allowed to fail. Her white gloves, drawn on fresh each evening, appear dozens of times in photographs from these years, extended in greeting, resting on the arm of a distinguished guest, holding a fan or champagne glass with perfect composure. They are not mere fashion accessories, but part of a uniform worn by someone whose job is to make the floating and landed palaces of her world function smoothly. Each pair of gloves represented not just expense, but also the constant renewal required to maintain appearances. They had to be spotless, perfectly fitted, replaced whenever they showed the slightest wear or stain. In this role, marriage has made her less a passive ornament and more a manager of an intricate, if constraining, enterprise. She controls significant aspects of New York and Newport social life, determines who receives invitations to the most prestigious gatherings, and serves as gatekeeper to the highest levels of American society. This is power, but power of a very specific kind, dependent on her husband's fortune and position, exercised entirely within the boundaries of social rather than economic or political realms, effective only so long as she maintains flawless performance. Yet even the most successful manager cannot control what happens when fortunes and ships change course unexpectedly. The steamship industry faced increasing competition and consolidation in the early 1900s. Estate values fluctuated with market conditions. Social hierarchies proved more fluid than they appeared, with new fortunes constantly challenging established families for position. Letters from later years show Tessie working harder to maintain influence as circumstances shifted, fighting battles to preserve status that once seemed unassailable. The work itself was invisible to most observers. That was the point. A successful hostess made entertaining appear natural and spontaneous rather than calculated and exhausting. The machinery had to run smoothly enough that guests never suspected how much effort went into creating apparently effortless elegance. Tessie succeeded brilliantly at this performance for years, establishing Rosecliff as a center of Newport society, and herself as a figure who commanded both respect and invitations. But the cost of such success rarely appears in the laudatory society columns or the architectural histories that celebrate Rosecliff's beauty. The cost was measured in constant vigilance, in the inability to relax even in her own home, in years spent managing others' opinions and expectations, in the reduction of a complex human being to a role that could not be questioned or modified without risking everything she had worked to build. In such scenes, Gloves are not mere fashion. They are part of a uniform worn by someone whose job is to make the floating and landed palaces of her world function smoothly, to cover not just hands, but also any hint that the person inside the role might want something different than what the role required. A New York Times notice dated 25 September 1900 reports that Mrs. Robert Goelet's large steam yacht, Nahma, will be laid up for the winter on the Clyde, a brief item among many in the society pages, yet one that captures a seasonal ritual central to the lives of the extremely wealthy, the withdrawal of pleasure vessels from active use, their storage in distant shipyards until the following spring, when the cycle of leisure would resume. The phrase laid up for the winter suggests rest, dormancy, a natural seasonal pattern, but it also suggests vulnerability, exposure to decay, and the possibility that return might not be guaranteed. Her husband, Robert Goelet, heir to a vast New York real estate fortune that included significant portions of Manhattan, had commissioned the Nahma in 1897 from Scottish designer George Lennox Watson, whose firm built some of the most prestigious yachts of the era. Contemporary accounts describe the vessel as a masterpiece of late Victorian yacht design, 226 feet long, white-hulled, with elegant proportions that balance speed with comfort. The interior, documented in maritime publications, featured carved teak panels, stained glass skylights, and accommodations luxurious enough to rival any shore estate. After Robert Goulet's death in 1899, the vessel continued to cruise European waters under his widow and son, but the yacht's later history reveals complications that society columns preferred not to mention. Family accounts and newspaper stories hint at tragedies associated with voyages, illnesses aboard, and an eventual refusal by some relatives to bring a body home aboard Nahma, a detail suggesting the yacht had become associated with darker memories than the elegant gatherings for which it was designed. Maritime superstition held that a yacht where tragedy occurred was marked, tainted, no longer purely a vehicle for pleasure. The decision to lay up the Nahma each winter was both practical and symbolic. Practical because North Atlantic winters made yachting uncomfortable and occasionally dangerous, because maintaining a crew year-round when the vessel would not be used added significant expense, because European shipyards offered better facilities for maintenance than American ports. Symbolic, because the rhythm of withdrawal and return reinforced the seasonal nature of elite life. Summers for Newport and European cruising, winters for New York social calendars and warmer destinations reached by steamship rather than private yacht. Yet each winter layup brought with it the possibility that the yacht might not return to the life it once carried. Economic reversals, family tragedies, changing priorities, the death of an owner, any of these could interrupt the expected cycle. Maritime records from the period show numerous yachts that were laid up and never quite revived, their owners deciding that the expense could no longer be justified or that circumstances had changed in ways that made the vessels surplus to requirements. In shipyards from the Clyde to Long Island Sound, elegant hulls sat idle through multiple winters, their paint fading, their machinery deteriorating, their eventual fate uncertain. For Mrs. Robert Goelet, the Nahma represented both privilege and burden. As a widow, she controlled the family fortune and the decisions about how to maintain or dispose of assets. The yacht required a crew of 30 to 40 during active seasons, consumed enormous quantities of coal, demanded constant maintenance to prevent deterioration of wood and metal exposed to salt water. Society expected her to maintain such a vessel, to appear at regattas, to cruise to appropriate destinations, to serve as hostess aboard during carefully orchestrated gatherings. Yet the same society that demanded these performances also required that they appear effortless, that the machinery and expense remain invisible behind polished brass and fresh paint. Contemporary photographs show the Nahma at anchor off various ports: Cowes, Nice, Newport, her profile elegant against harbor backgrounds, flags flying, crew visible on deck, maintaining the appearance of readiness for whatever entertainment might be required. What the photographs cannot show is the constant calculation involved in maintaining such a vessel. The quarterly meetings with estate managers, the decisions about crew wages and coal purchases, the insurance policies that protected against loss but cost thousands annually, the shore facilities required when the yacht was not in active use. Letters between yacht owners preserved in maritime museum archives reveal a community that shared both pride in their vessels and anxiety about the expense of maintaining them. One owner wrote to another in 1901, "I confess that Adriana has become something of a white elephant, beautiful certainly, but consuming resources at an alarming rate. Yet to sell would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that one can no longer maintain the standard. So we continue, season after season, wondering if this might be the last." The phrase "laid up for the winter" thus carries multiple meanings. The practical storage of a vessel during months when it cannot be comfortably used, but also the metaphorical hibernation of a lifestyle that required constant effort to sustain. The acknowledgement that even vast fortunes had limits, that the floating palaces and their associated performances were more fragile than they appeared. A palace without its people, exposed to rust and storm and the simple physics of deterioration, revealed itself as machinery rather than magic, expensive to purchase, more expensive to maintain, and always subject to the possibility of irreversible decline. In historical accounts of the Goelet family and their various properties, the Nahma appears periodically, mentioned in lists of assets, noted in society columns, occasionally photographed. But the yacht story has no clear conclusion in public records. It was laid up, presumably multiple times. Whether it returned to active use each spring, how long the family maintained it, when and how they finally disposed of it, these details vanish into the gaps between documented moments. The absence of information is itself revealing. The yacht mattered enough to be built and named and photographed, but not enough for its ultimate fate to be carefully recorded. For the women who stood on its decks during summer seasons, wearing elaborate yachting costumes, managing gracious conversations while hiding seasickness, performing the role of elegant leisure, the yacht was simultaneously platform and constraint. It provided spectacular settings for social performance, but also required that performance to be constantly maintained. Each winter lay-up brought a kind of relief. The season was over. The demanding audiences had dispersed. The relentless obligation to appear elegant and composed could be temporarily set aside. Yet each spring brought the expectation that it would all begin again, that the yacht would emerge from storage with fresh paint, and the women who hosted aboard it would emerge with renewed commitment to performing their assigned roles. Each winter lay-up brings the possibility that the yacht may never quite return to the life it once carried, and that possibility, acknowledged or not, shadows every elegant afternoon at sea. On 6 November 1895, when Consuelo Vanderbilt married Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, at St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue in New York, newspaper coverage transformed the event into a spectacle of international significance. Illustrations in the New York Times, Harper's Weekly, and European publications show carriages crowding the street outside the church, crowds of onlookers pressing against police barriers, heavy veils and elaborate gowns suggesting both wealth and solemnity. The wedding is called, repeatedly and without irony, the wedding of the century, though the century still has 5 years remaining, and the phrase reveals more about aspirations than accuracy. The ocean is an unspoken presence in all this coverage. Consuelo's dowry, contemporary accounts put it at $2.5 million in railroad stock plus an annual income of $100,000, is effectively a bridge between American capital and English architecture in need of repair. Blenheim Palace, the Churchill family seat, had been deteriorating for decades. Its roof leaked, its plumbing was primitive, its heating barely functional. The marriage was, among other things, a real estate transaction, American money in exchange for an English title, with Consuelo herself serving as the human mechanism for transferring wealth across the Atlantic. Letters she wrote in the weeks before the wedding, now preserved in various archives, show awareness of this machinery. "Mother speaks of duty and family position," she writes to a friend. "The Duke is polite and distant. I am told I should feel honored, and perhaps I should, but I feel instead like cargo being loaded onto a very elegant ship, valuable and carefully handled, but still merely cargo. The metaphor is apt. The wedding was preceded by months of negotiations between lawyers representing both families, documents specifying exactly how the dowry would be paid and what financial arrangements would be made if the marriage ended. The ceremony itself lasted less than an hour. Consuelo wore a gown designed to satisfy both American and English expectations. White satin with a train that required 4 attendants, Brussels lace that had belonged to her grandmother, and a veil that covered her face until the vows were spoken. Contemporary accounts note that she appeared pale and composed, that her voice barely carried when she spoke her vows, that her mother watched with an expression of satisfaction while Consuelo's father, excluded from the wedding party due to his divorce from Alva, stood in the back of the church. In The Glitter and the Gold, published decades later when both marriages and illusions had ended, Consuelo writes with measured reflection about what followed. Crossing to England aboard a transatlantic liner, arriving at Blenheim to find a palace so vast and cold she couldn't imagine ever thinking of it as home, learning that the aristocratic life she'd been prepared for bore little resemblance to reality. When I recovered, we returned to Blenheim and to the routine of house parties, and I to the duties of a chatelaine. She writes, the word duties encompassing everything from managing dozens of servants to entertaining guests to bearing heirs who would secure the succession. The marriage is a kind of permanent mooring, a woman anchored to a house whose financial tides are controlled elsewhere. Her dowry repairs Blenheim's roof, updates its plumbing, restores its grounds. Contemporary accounts note these improvements with satisfaction, treating the marriage as a success because the physical plant has been preserved. What the accounts rarely mention is that Consuelo, having served her primary function by bringing capital and producing 2 sons, finds herself increasingly peripheral to the life of the estate she helped save. Her husband pursues other relationships. Her mother-in-law treats her with polite disdain. The English aristocracy that was supposed to welcome her maintains a careful distance, accepting her money while making clear that acceptance of her person comes with reservations. Letters she wrote to American friends during these years, carefully preserved and later published, chart a different journey than the one described in society columns. I have learned to find satisfaction in small things, she wrote in 1900. The gardens at Blenheim are beautiful in spring. I read more than I did in Newport. Sometimes I walk the grounds alone for hours. It is a quiet life, which is perhaps what I needed, though not what I expected or desired when I stood in St. Thomas's wearing that elaborate gown. The yachts and steamers that carried her across the Atlantic, first for her honeymoon, later for occasional visits to America, recede into the background of her daily life, but they remain symbolically significant. Each crossing reinforces the distance between the world she came from and the one she now inhabits, even as ships continue carrying wealthy Americans to Europe, drawn by titles and tradition, and the appealing fiction that aristocracy represents something more elevated than mere money. Her letters begin to suggest that the transaction is more complicated than either side anticipated. The Americans get titles but not necessarily respect. The English get money but resent needing it. Everyone performs their roles while privately calculating whether the exchange was worth the cost. The logic of the marriage, when examined coldly, is the same logic that governs yachts and palaces and all the other machinery of Gilded Age privilege. Display requires maintenance. Maintenance requires resources. Resources require strategic alliances that often have little to do with personal preference or happiness. Consuelo was trained to host, to charm, to stabilize an institution larger than herself. She learned those skills on yacht decks and in Newport ballrooms, practiced them at finishing schools, and during carefully supervised courtships. The training was excellent. She succeeded at everything she was taught to do. What the training could not address was what happened after success, after the wedding, after the first son was born, after the initial social triumph faded into the daily reality of a life chosen by others and executed according to their specifications. Even as ships still carry rich Americans to Europe, her letters chart something different, a movement from obedience to a more complicated inner independence. she learns to find satisfaction outside the roles assigned to her. She develops relationships and interests that her husband and society neither approve nor can fully control. She begins, slowly and carefully, to construct a self that exists apart from the position she occupies. It takes years, decades, eventually, but the process begins during those early years at Blenheim, when she realizes that the marriage has consumed everything she was prepared to give, and still demands more than she can sustain. The gloves remain spotless in photographs, but the hands inside them are learning to move in ways no finishing school ever taught, finding small freedoms within a framework that allows almost none. By the 1910s and early 1920s, the record grew crowded with endings that arrived not dramatically but as administrative details, brief notices in maritime publications, auction catalogs, and estate settlements. On 25th of July, 1892, the first Alva lies wrecked off Cape Cod, her elegant interior scattered across the seabed. Local newspapers carry the story for a few days before other news displaces it, and within months the wreck is remembered primarily by salvage divers and marine historians interested in documenting such losses. The yacht that once represented the pinnacle of private maritime luxury becomes data: tonnage, location, depth, condition of wreckage. The Gould yacht Atalanta serves, decades under different flags, far from the carefully curated gatherings of its early years. After Jay Gould's death, the yacht is sold to the Venezuelan government, where it becomes the gunboat Restaurador and serves in various Latin American conflicts. Maritime historians who trace the vessel's itinerary note that it continues sailing well into the 1910s, its white paint replaced by naval gray, its elegant saloons converted to military purposes, the same decks that once hosted afternoon tea parties now mounting artillery. It is the same vessel in technical terms: hull, engines, basic structure intact, but transformed so completely in function that nothing remains of its original identity except the physical shell. Club newsletters and maritime enthusiast publications note other steam yachts laid up for the winter and never fully revived, their varnish peeling in forgotten berths from Long Island Sound to the Clyde. Some are eventually scrapped, their metal and machinery recycled. Others are sold to foreign buyers who convert them to commercial or military use. A few survive as curiosities, maintained by later generations who appreciate their craftsmanship but cannot recreate the social world that gave them meaning. Insurance records and probate files show the gradual erosion of value. Yachts listed as major assets in 1890s estate inventories appeared as depreciated items or outright liabilities by 1920, their maintenance costs exceeding any practical return. A later generation of maritime historians describes the entire era as a brief lap of luxury on inland seas and coastal waters, emphasizing how quickly such extravagance disappeared after World War I. The war itself disrupted the transatlantic social circuits that sustained yacht culture. Families lost sons and fortunes. European aristocracies faced political upheaval. The easy movement between continents became complicated by new tensions and restrictions. More fundamentally, the war shifted cultural attitudes. Conspicuous displays of wealth that had seemed natural or even admirable in 1900 appeared vulgar or inappropriate by 1920. And the yachts became symbols of an excess that the new era rejected. In probate records and auction catalogs from the 1920s and 1930s, yachts appear as line items valued primarily by tonnage and potential scrap value. Descriptions that once emphasized elegance and craftsmanship now focus on mechanical condition and conversion possibilities. Former private yacht, well-maintained engines suitable for conversion to commercial service or private use with significant renovation, reads one typical listing. The phrase former private yacht does heavy work. It acknowledges the vessel's origins while making clear that those origins no longer determine its value or purpose. These endings are rarely dramatic. Most are slow, administrative, the grand silhouettes reduced to paperwork and rust. No society columns report the final voyage of most yachts. No obituaries mark their passing. They simply cease to be listed in club registries, stop appearing in harbor reports, vanish from the documentary record as quietly as they once dominated it. The exception proves the rule. When a famous yacht meets a spectacular end, sinking in a storm, burning at dock, newspapers treat it as newsworthy precisely because such drama is unusual. Most yachts die incrementally, through neglect and changing circumstances, their components scattered or recycled long before anyone thinks to mark the loss. For the women who once stood on those decks, the disappearance of the yachts mirrors larger transformations in their own lives. Some, like Consuelo Vanderbilt, find ways to adapt and eventually divorce, using their titles and connections to build new roles in philanthropy or public life. Others retreat into smaller circles, maintaining what remnants they can of the old social systems while recognizing that the world has moved on. A few, documented in memoirs and family histories, express relief, the ending of an exhausting performance, the lifting of obligations that had consumed decades. Letters and diaries from this transitional period show women reflecting on what the yachts had meant and what their absence reveals. I thought I would miss the summers in Newport, the crossings to Europe, the elegance of it all, one woman wrote in 1924. Instead, I find I'm grateful for the simplicity. We sold the yacht 5 years ago, after my husband's death, and I expected to feel diminished. Instead, I feel lighter, as if I've been released from an obligation I never fully understood I was carrying. The yacht required so much maintenance, crew, constant attention, and I required so much of myself to appear worthy of it. Now both of us can rest. In museum exhibitions and local history archives, photographs from the golden age of steam yachts show the vessels in their prime. Black and white prints of long hulls and crowded decks, occasionally captioned simply, "Steam yacht once owned by." The vagueness of such captions reflects how quickly specific details were forgotten once the social world that gave them meaning disappeared. The yachts become generic representatives of an era rather than individual vessels with distinct histories. Researchers trying to trace particular yachts often encounter gaps in the record, years where documentation doesn't exist, sales that weren't formally recorded, final dispositions that remain mysterious. Yet, in photographs and family stories, the yachts linger, still polished, still sunlit, forever frozen in that brief moment when everything appeared perfect and permanent. Contemporary viewers, looking at images of elegantly dressed women on yacht decks, see only the surface, the beautiful costumes, the apparent leisure, the glamour of a vanished world. What's invisible in the photographs is everything that made those moments possible: the labor, the expense, the constant performance, the machinery, both literal and social, that sustained the illusion of effortless elegance. The yachts themselves were merely the most visible component of a vast system of privilege that required constant maintenance to function and collapse quickly once that maintenance could no longer be sustained. The endings, though scattered across decades and continents, share a common trajectory, from symbol to burden to memory to data, each transformation stripping away another layer of meaning until only the physical facts remain. In the early 21st century, visitors walk through Marble House, Rosecliff, and other Newport mansions now operated as museums by the Preservation Society of Newport County. Tour guides explain that these cottages survived thanks to a combination of family preservation efforts, architectural significance, and public fundraising campaigns that began in the mid-20th century when many similar estates were being demolished or subdivided. The rooms that once hosted 400 guests for a single evening now accommodate a steady stream of tourists who move through roped-off spaces, observing but not touching the furniture that remains, trying to imagine the sound and movement that once filled these now silent halls. In climate-controlled display cases and archival storage drawers, curators handle fragile textiles, fans with painted silk and carved ivory, parasols with elaborate lace trim, and sometimes gloves preserved as examples of period fashion. Contemporary museum practice requires wearing white cotton conservation gloves when handling such items, creating a strange doubling. 21st century hands wearing simple cotton gloves touch 19th century kid leather gloves that once covered hands that lived in a completely different social universe. The ritual of preservation mirrors the ritual that created the objects, both involving careful attention to detail and the understanding that these are not simply things but evidence of entire systems of meaning. Preservation specialists explain that kid leather gloves are particularly challenging to conserve. The leather degrades over time, becoming brittle and discolored. Dyes fade or bleed. The small pearl buttons and delicate embroidery require careful handling. Yet enough examples survive to allow historians to reconstruct the elaborate taxonomy that once governed glove wearing. Day gloves, evening gloves, opera gloves, driving gloves, each type signifying specific occasions and levels of formality. Museum labels explain these distinctions to contemporary visitors who live in an era where gloves are primarily functional rather than symbolic, where the elaborate codes that once governed every detail of appearance have largely disappeared. Nearby, in maritime museums and digital archives, images of Atalanta, Nahma, Alva, and dozens of other steam yachts show the vessels in their prime. These are typically black and white photographs or engravings from contemporary publications, occasionally enhanced with digital restoration. Long hulls cutting through water, decks crowded with figures in period dress, flags and pennants identifying ownership and nationality. The images are often captioned simply "steam yacht, once owned by," followed by a family name that contemporary viewers may or may not recognize. Research notes accompanying the images describe technical specifications, length, tonnage, builder, engines, but rarely capture what it felt like to stand on those decks, to move through those interiors, to perform the elaborate social rituals that the yachts made possible. Digital archives maintained by institutions like the Mariners Museum, the New York Yacht Club, and various historical societies allow researchers to trace individual vessels across decades, connecting scattered references in newspaper articles, club records, and maritime registries. This digital aggregation reveals patterns invisible in any single source. The concentration of yacht ownership in a small number of families, the seasonal rhythms that governed usage, the eventual dispersal and transformation of vessels that once dominated harbor spaces. Yet, for all the data now available, significant gaps remain, particularly regarding the human experiences aboard these vessels, the daily realities that rarely made it into formal records. William K. Vanderbilt II's later yacht, also named Alva in honor of his mother, represents a kind of evolution in the tradition. Built in 1931 and later renamed Cangarda, the vessel was larger and more technically sophisticated than earlier yachts, reflecting both advances in maritime engineering and the persistence of yacht culture among some wealthy families even after World War I had disrupted the broader social systems that sustained it. Vanderbilt eventually converted his Long Island estate into a museum preserving his collections, and models of his yachts appear among the exhibits. Miniature representations of vessels that once carried real social weight, but now exist primarily as examples of craftsmanship and period taste. Contemporary museum interpretation struggles with how to present this material, how to acknowledge both the genuine artistry and craftsmanship involved in creating these objects and spaces, and the social systems that made such artistry possible and necessary. Exhibition labels carefully describe the lives of heiresses, the elaborate training they received, the strategic marriages they entered, trying to be neither condemnatory nor romanticizing, seeking a tone that allows historical complexity to speak for itself. Visitor responses reveal the challenge. Some see only glamour and beauty, others see only constraint and wasted potential. Most see something more ambiguous that resists simple judgment. The work of preserving and interpreting this material, the mansions, the artifacts, the photographs, the documents, has become itself a kind of performance, one that replaces the original social performances while attempting to explain them. Tour guides at Newport estates learn scripts describing the architectural details, the family histories, the social significance of particular rooms and objects. Museum educators develop programs helping school groups understand how people lived in the Gilded Age, what their daily lives involved, and why the social hierarchies mattered to those who maintained them. Archivists process collections of letters and photographs, creating finding aids that make once private material available to researchers. The roles once performed by heiresses, hostess mediator, symbol of family prestige and social continuity, are now performed by institutions and their staff who translate marble and metal into stories that can be understood by contemporary audiences whose own social experiences differ dramatically from those of the people who built and inhabited these spaces. This translation is never complete or perfect. Something always gets lost in moving from lived experience to preserved artifacts, to museum interpretation to visitor understanding. Yet the effort continues because these objects and spaces remain powerful, evoking both attraction and unease, beauty and constraint, representing possibilities both lost and rightly rejected. As contemporary curators handle preserved gloves, reading accession records that rarely include the names of the women who wore them, they recognize that these objects are all that remain of performances that consumed entire lives. The gloves are anonymous now, detached from specific hands and occasions, representing an entire social class rather than individual women. Yet they retain something, perhaps just the shape of hands that last wore them, perhaps some trace of the elaborate codes they once embodied, perhaps simply the fact of their survival when so much else has disappeared. A faded photograph of a yacht at anchor off Newport, its decks crowded for an afternoon party, sits in an archive folder. The shot has been digitized, made available online, tagged with metadata that allows researchers to find it through keyword searches. In the original, someone once wrote in a neat hand only a date and a name, August 1902, Nahma. No other context, assuming that readers would know what those words signified, who owned the yacht, what the occasion was, why the image mattered enough to preserve. Contemporary viewers see elegant figures in period dress but cannot reconstruct the specific social calculus that determined who stood where, who spoke to whom, what was accomplished or failed during that particular afternoon. Beside the photograph, in another archive box, rest gloves preserved as examples of late Victorian fashion, their kid leather carefully maintained under controlled temperature and humidity, occasionally displayed in exhibitions about Gilded Age life or women's history. The labels note the approximate date, the materials, the technique of construction. They do not note, because documentation does not exist, who wore them, on what occasions, what those occasions meant to the wearer, whether the gloves were put on eagerly or reluctantly, whether they were remembered with nostalgia or relief. The objects survive, but the lived experiences they represent remain inaccessible except through speculation informed by other sources, letters, diaries, memoirs, that provide context while acknowledging that context is not the same as understanding. The work of preservation continues, careful and meticulous, attending to objects that represent a world simultaneously fascinating and alien, beautiful and constraining, worth studying while recognizing that studying is not the same as endorsing. The gloves are no longer a young woman's armor, a protective layer between self and society, a tool for performing roles that allow no alternatives. Instead, they are a curator's responsibility. Evidence of social systems worth understanding, artifacts that provoke questions about performance and authenticity, privilege and constraint, the prices paid for elegance that could never be allowed to appear as anything but effortless. As the camera lingers on a gloved hand gently straightening a century-old photograph of a steam yacht, the opening image returns transformed, the gloves preserving the memory of floating palaces that could not survive their own seasons.